what George didn't mention is that this past spring, you know, as many schools do, you know, at this point, you're starting to kind of look at what resources do you need, and you start kind of horse trading a little bit. And last year, it really struck me that I could use a second legal person in the office. And Jefferson really wanted to move on and do some more work with innovation and not as much government relations. And so the deal was struck that if I took on government relations, I could have a staff attorney. And, you know, my main thought at the time was, you know, well, the federal government has been so quiet for so long. So if you want to blame the election on anybody, I'm one of those people that things happen to, and it would be my fault. I'm going to try to, you know, hopefully sort of toggle back and forth a little bit between these so that we can have some conversation. Here's all of my contact information. You know, I see some familiar names on the screen. I know I've talked or emailed with some of you before. I'm always open for talking with schools. I talk to administrators, teachers, all the angry parent phone calls in the office come to me. I do work with individual schools on a regular basis. So I'm always happy to have that conversation. As you know, I can't be your school's attorney. I have one client, and that's the association, and it keeps me plenty busy. But I'm always happy to talk through issues. And what I've found with schools over the last almost 17 years now of doing this is so much of it is just talking it through and helping just to kind of think through and issue spot some of the issues that you're facing. We're going to go through sort of some of these pieces, and then I want to go through some, you know, the first part, including the Trump administration overview, I won't spend too much time on, but there's so much happening out there that's causing a lot of sort of static in our environment that I think we should talk about a little bit. But then I want to get into some hypotheticals. George very kindly asked you for some issues or questions that were, I'm trying to figure out where that feedback is coming from. Asked you for some sort of questions that were bothering you and things. So I've built some of those in here as well, and so we'll get into those. I'm happy to announce actually that we've launched our new website today, and so all of these legal and government relations resources on the website are so much easier to find, and they're much more attractive. Towards the end, if I've got some time, I'll show you the new NEIS Washington Watch. You know, I spent the better part of the end of January and February writing about immigration, and then the latter part of February rewriting about immigration. And so it seemed to be a good time to launch, you know, another resource to really keep schools up to date on what's happening in Washington. So we have all of these pieces in place, including these specific topics. We've got a big piece on student sexual assault coming up soon that I think will be really useful to schools, because that's probably one of the biggest questions that I'm getting out there right now. So just to kind of get our feet underneath us a little bit, I tend to focus with my colleague Whitney on the federal government. We've got the Constitution that delegates the authority to Congress to pass legislation, and Congress gives the authority to the agencies to pass regulations. The executive branch, of course, appoints the heads of the agencies. Some of you might know that that's going very slowly right now. And we have this new animal, you know, which a lot of presidents have used before, but which President Trump has used probably more aggressively than others in these executive orders. So we're seeing a lot of action from the courts in particular, but a lot of these executive orders relate to the agencies. Executive orders, just so you know where the battlegrounds lie, the president needs to have the authority to actually make the executive order, and it must be reasonable in terms of court precedent. If any of you have watched the really interesting testimony with Sally Yates up on the Hill, which for anybody who's a Ted Cruz fan might not have gone as swimmingly, but it was really interesting to watch her kind of get into it with him about what DOJ looks at in particular when it comes down to executive orders and the enforceability and constitutionality of some of those. So that's been kind of an interesting twist that we've been watching for the last couple of months. The courts, of course, are the referees on all of this. With the Trump administration, I say they've been more like the bumpers on a bowling alley that you put up for kids, you know, trying to keep it in the lane. And then state issues are the same thing. So I was talking to a school from New York actually earlier today, and we were talking about student education records laws in New York. So the federal government has FERPA. It's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, but it's only triggered if a school takes federal funds from the Department of Education, which is almost impossible to do. But some states have adopted those whole hog and just applied them to all schools within the state. So they can raise the floor, they can make it more stringent, but they can't lower the floor. So generally speaking, I spend most of the time in the federal structure, but a lot of schools come up with questions that trigger state issues, and we'll get into a couple of those. So of course, this really was something. Your New York issue, it kind of became a national issue when Trump was elected into the White House in November. I'm proud to say that my brother in London cleaned up on the betting floors in London about who was going to win the election. And, you know, it's really, it's become a pretty big class battle in our country. This sign I thought really jumped out at me if you've read the Hillbilly Elegy and some of these other pieces that are out there about how this election has gone this way. You know, it's really become a class battle in a lot of ways. And we're seeing that play out with things like the Affordable Care Act and the directions that's taking. And then, of course, you have huge movements that we haven't seen in this country probably since Vietnam, in terms of people finally looking up from their phones and really engaging in political discourse, which is exciting and sort of scary all at the same time. And I think I could probably do an entire presentation around New Yorker cartoons. And this was one of my favorites from this past election cycle, because it is true, the number of just sort of random things that have come out of the Trump administration or out of the White House are really pretty extraordinary. And if you haven't pulled this report, I highly recommend looking at it. This is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it's about the Trump effect. And I don't know that it's so much about the Trump effect, but it's about really sort of the effect of the political discourse of this past year on our nation's schools and some of the shakeout that we've seen from that direction. And of course, we've just passed 100 days, and Trump's job approval ratings are the lowest that they've ever been for any president in the first 100 days since we started tracking this data, which goes all the way back to Truman. So I do want to talk about Congress for a few minutes. The nominations are very, very slow moving. Congress has been so incredibly slow to approve any nominees. Some might never occur. The Trump administration has said, you know, I don't know that we need all of these appointed positions, including in areas like the intelligence community, State Department, other places that, you know, before they've been seen as, you know, pretty fundamental to how things work. Congress right now, they're pretty tied up with government funding and debt ceilings, all of which makes me go to sleep, but it's keeping them from getting to a lot of the in-depth pieces. You've got the Affordable Care Act, now the, you know, American Health Care Act, and that's been kind of an interesting shakeout. If anybody's, you know, kind of read the act, and I would venture to say that half the people who voted on the act didn't read the act. A lot of people, a lot of congressmen who say they voted for it, so they did it mostly to move it to the Senate. I don't know that it's still going to go anywhere. It really wasn't thought through, and there's obviously been big pushback. A lot of interest in tax reform. The Higher Education Act is probably the most pushing thing in education at the moment, and then immigration. But when it comes down to it, what is actually happening? I mean, yes, you've got a Health Care Act that's cleared the House of Representatives, but it still has to get through the Senate. And so not much is actually happening when you really look at it. And this has sort of been therapeutic for me because there's so much noise, there's so much excitement. It's really hard to get a handle on it. From our school's perspective, things to watch. We've got the Betsy DeVos confirmation. In the Trump campaign, they kept talking about a $20 billion school choice proposal. And I would note with this administration, when they talk about school choice, they're talking not just about vouchers, but they're also talking about charter schools. And what we've seen in some of our data collections and what we know anecdotally from our schools is that when you're talking about charter schools, you're also talking about competition for our schools. So while the vouchers might help some of our schools, that charter school piece can really mean big competition for us. And what some of our research shows is when we have charter schools in different parts of the country, the appetite for tuition gets pretty soft. We get to meet with Betsy DeVos a few weeks ago, And that was right when the skinny budget came out, and there's a whole group of us. It was the CAPE group. We were meeting with her, and somebody posed the question, so Secretary DeVos, how do you think that you'll be administering this $250 million if this truly comes to pass? And being a good politician, she turned the question around and said, well, how do you think we should administer the $250 million if it comes to pass? So, I mean, they really don't know where this is going to come from. You're much more likely to see it in a tax credit type package that might be sort of funding on scholarships at state levels, and we do see that in a few states. Right now, we're pulling data on all of this together, so that's just something to watch. The immigration pieces, you guys have probably all been watching this pretty carefully. The courts have been kicking this around a little bit like a soccer ball. We do still have these executive orders out there. We'll talk a little bit about what to do with them, but it's certainly something that we're watching carefully, because we suspect we'll see more vetting for visas if you've got international students, if you have international employees. Watch for more sort of extreme vetting, a lot more questions, a lot more time to secure these visas. The wage and hour, I know everybody kind of scampered around trying to get ready for that this fall, and then we had a stay. You're going to see wage and hour eventually come through. We finally have a secretary for the Department of Labor, and these regulations will come to pass. The salary levels won't be quite so high. Probably the biggest thing for you to watch and to be aware of is that the Republican tax plans, the last couple of drafts, have involved getting rid of tuition remission. About 96% of our schools use some form of tuition remission. This is how we give, free or reduced tuition to our staff members. And they're talking about getting rid of 127, which is a tax-free benefit to pay for tuition for our employees who are going back to school. We're working with higher ed pretty closely on this one, but 117D in particular is just for educational institutions. And they see it as, sort of one of those weird one-liners in the tax code that they're pretty committed to getting rid of. Charitable giving is usually a plus for us under the Republicans, but they're talking about doing a cap on the amount of deductions that you can take for charitable giving. So that's something we're watching pretty carefully too. And then, of course, there's been a lot of activity on the Supreme Court. We've got Neil Gorsuch up there now. There's a question about whether the Democrats were wasting political chips, sort of fighting his nomination. And then we got a lot of other activity in the courts. In the Blaine Amendment, we just had a hearing in front of the Supreme Court talking about religious schools being allowed to participate in state programs. Recent immigration hearings, this was sort of a big one where the administration is arguing that even immaterial misrepresentations on immigration forms could lead to deportation. Something like, I've never broken the law, but you were speeding a couple weeks ago. The Hotchkiss case, which is a big deal for New York schools because it's a neighboring state, continues to sort of drag through the courts. This is the tick bite case that was worth over $40 million. It just was in front of the Supreme Court a couple weeks ago. Executive order challenges, as I mentioned, and then we're still seeing action on transgender cases. Now those are in front of 2 courts of appeal, and sexual orientation cases. And those last 2 bullet points, a really important thing to note is that the courts of appeals, the ones that are pretty conservative are getting more so, and the ones that are liberal are also getting more so. So we're gonna see some interesting clashes when they get up to the Supreme Court, which they'll do pretty quickly. All of these interest groups are starting to fund appeals up to the Supreme Court, so we're gonna see a lot of action there over the next couple of years. That was sort of a quick and dirty run through a lot of what we're seeing on the federal front, but I just kind of want to give you some insight into what was happening with the Trump administration, what's happening on the Hill. Are there any questions on any of these topics, whether it's immigration or labor or tax, Supreme Court, or anything that you're worried about or anything that you're hearing?
And just remember, all you need to do is to unmute your microphone if you want to speak, and the rest should work.
Anyone?
This is Virginia. I'm pretty good on what you just discussed, so.
Excellent. Hey, Virginia.
Hi.
All right.
Deborah, can I ask you a follow-up question on tuition remission? Could you could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So tuition remission is, it's that nice handy benefit that only we get to use in higher education. where we provide free tuition, or a lot of schools it might be 50% or 75%, or you might have one kid comes free and then the other kid comes 50%, and they've got to be employees of the school. And an incredible number of our schools use it. It's not financial aid, although your financial aid system can be set up to kind of use to help figure out what percentage of tuition remission schools get. But it's a pretty big benefit. And when we look at our DAZZLE data, it's somewhere in the mid-90s in terms of percentage of our schools that offer that benefit to staff. And they're talking about totally getting rid of it from the tax code. So that would no longer be a tax-free benefit.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming. I actually have a call on it, I think on Thursday morning, working with higher education. You might have seen a survey that we just did on it, kind of getting a little more into the weeds on the topic, because it's been a huge consistent benefit for our schools and for higher education over time.
Debra, this is Laura. Can you talk about housing for faculty? I know that's been in the works a little bit about taxable income and where that is.
Sure. Happily we have not seen that on the chopping block, which is sort of a good thing. What I know anecdotally is at least a couple of years ago, more schools were running into IRS audits related to it, and ensuring that the housing is really on campus or truly used in school activities if it's sort of adjacent to campus. It's an area that if you're providing that kind of housing, and I know this is a big issue in New York, particularly in the city, you want to be pretty clean on that. So you can do two things. You can have housing that's totally tax-free and it meets a certain test. So it's on campus. It's a requirement of that position. Usually it's the head of school. Sometimes you have one or two other people who also live on campus. It's owned by the school. All of those kinds of things. And over time, we've seen sort of mission creep among schools, and that the housing seems to move further and further away, and that maybe school events aren't held there, that kind of thing. So it definitely has come up in IRS audits. I haven't seen it as much in terms of federal regulations or federal legislation trying to get rid of it. The other way, if you've got housing and it doesn't qualify for that totally tax-free benefit, you're basically renting it to them for I think it's 5% of the fair market value or something like that. And you can do that and make it taxable if you're providing that. So there are different calculations that you can put in to cover that outside of that tax-free treatment.
Thank you, Debra.
Of course. Anyone else? Okay. So every day, the news and social media carry an item from the federal government stirring moral outrage of staff and students alike. This moral outrage on one side of the political spectrum is stirring additional outrage on the other side of the spectrum. Staff and students want to march and write and call on anything else to be heard. Can your school take these steps? And this was probably one of the biggest questions that I got, particularly in the weeks following the election, and certainly going into January, even up to the climate change march where, so many 10,000 people descended on DC last weekend. Lots of staff and students really wanting to be politically involved and doing it under the umbrella of the school. And for heads of school, a certain amount of pressure to come out with politically charged statements. And it's an area where you do have to be kind of careful. This is a handy dandy chart from the IRS, getting into sort of your tax status. And there's only certain things that you can do as a nonprofit, and particularly engaging in that legislative active advocacy, which is what we do at NEIS, and we file a certain form to kind of cover the amount of time that we spend lobbying. The big issue is that candidate election advocacy. Some of you might have seen a document that I did about this topic this summer, where you need to be very careful. That engaging candidate election advocacy is also what Trump is talking about with the Johnson Amendment. He's talking about letting particularly religious entities get involved in that level of advocacy, which has been a no-fly zone for nonprofits for a very, very long time. And a lot of nonprofits feel that that should stay there because it just muddies the water so much between the public good and getting involved in political activity. It's important to remember this chart, but as I've talked to more and more schools, the real fundamental issue here is making sure that whatever you're engaging in on this front stays mission issue oriented, because you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube afterwards. I had schools you know, the first few days I had a lot of teachers writing sort of Jerry Maguire type missives and sort of hitting send and sending them out to a whole staff and all parents and all kinds of things. But also, you know, parents who wanted to use the art room to make posters for marches and this and that and the other thing. And you've got to remember that while it's very exciting that everybody's as politically engaged as they are, you are still a nonprofit and you want to stay really firmly oriented on your mission, which means that you can get involved in climate change marches, particularly if that's part of your school's mission, diversity issues, other fronts, but just make sure that it's still tying back to your school's mission, what you believe in, where the issues are. For students, it's kind of interesting because they have a lot more political leeway, even including on the campaign advocacy front. And they're a little bit more of a moving target, right? They do eventually graduate, and it's kind of more in the context of their education and their class experience. The other piece to remember too, and I know this is the case in New York State, is you can end up with faculty that are on one side of the political spectrum and parents that are on the other side of the political spectrum, or a parent body that's split right down the middle. And maintaining some degree of sort of a political safe zone in your school is going to be really key, not just now, but when we get to these midterm elections. I don't know if anybody saw that footage of the Democrats singing to the Republicans in the House, singing "Hey, hey, hey, goodbye" after they voted for the Health Care Act. You know, these midterm elections are going to be dark. You know, we haven't seen great political discourse over the last year. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better through the course of this administration. Have any of you hit this, and how have you managed it if you have seen this in your school?
Deborah, this is Ellen Porter from Manhattan Country School.
Hey, Al.
Are you getting a lot of feedback?
Somebody just muted themselves. I think it was feeding back a little bit.
Okay, I just lowered it. Maybe that'll make a difference.
Yep, you sound great.
Okay. You know, Manhattan Country School is an activist school.
Right.
So we have, it's interesting to hear you say that as long as it's mission issue oriented, and our mission is clearly, you know, clearly states what the policies of the school are and what the, you know, the thrust of the school is. And so we have had a couple of instances where the kids wanted to go out and march or leave, you know, where there were these moments where, you know, they were asking people either to leave their work or leave their school to do like a sit-in or something. Mm-hmm. And they were given permission to leave and do it not under the auspices of the school.
Right.
But they were not, you know, charged with any absenteeism for going and you know, doing it. Right. But then there were some things that the school felt, you know, like they had an immigration march, and that is, you know, really part of the school's mission. You know, our diversity is the bedrock of the school. And that was done, you know, a lot of people from school went and everyone went together. But that's how we've been doing it. If kids feel strongly about, you know, appearing in different places for marches or standing up for something, they're allowed to go.
Yeah. Yeah, the one, I think that's awesome. I think it's awesome that that's part of your mission, particularly, and I know the immigration issues have been a big deal in the Mid-Atlantic. I don't know how many of us have been wrestling with that, but that's been huge. And the one thing I would encourage is just making sure that safety stays in the forefront. It's been a very strange time. I mean, I think most of the marches have been pretty peaceful. I was actually a little worried about the inauguration, and I had friends in the intelligence realm who were sort of encouraging us to stay away from it because, you know, they didn't give a place for protesters to be at the inauguration, and nobody was sure how that was going to shake out exactly. And so that's something that I'm just keeping aware of in different parts of the country. I'm not as worried about it in New York because New York as a whole is pretty used to managing large numbers of people. I think it's, you know, but you know, things have definitely jumped the shark a couple times. And so when you've got groups of students, just to be aware of your risk management program, you know, sort of approach doing it, I think is big.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else been working through any of these issues? Okay. A link to a website called www.greenhillsbadinfluences.com, and you are Green Hills, has been sent to you from an anonymous account. The channel, it's a YouTube channel, has videos attacking 4 of your teachers, 2 for being gay, 1 for being Jewish, and 1 for being a Muslim and wearing the hijab. The videos have footage from pornographic movies with the teachers' heads dubbed onto them and other disturbing images, some of them violent. You trace the website back to the co-captains of the boys lacrosse team, because of course everybody beats on the boys lacrosse team. They said that 3 other boys helped them set it up. 3 other boys on the lacrosse team. What do you do? How would this play out in your school? And this is a variation on a real life example that has happened since the election.
At my school, they'd probably be expelled immediately.
Okay, what if the and then is that you find out all of the boys on the lacrosse team somehow contributed to this video? Because, you know, we teach them collaboration and creativity and using technology and all that stuff.
Yes, but in a responsible way.
Yeah.
I think if that was the case, I mean, there'd have to be, you know, I couldn't imagine some expulsions not happening. Obviously, a major, you know, educational piece.
Yeah.
But zero tolerance for, I mean, at Masters, we have zero tolerance for behavior like that. I mean,
yeah.
But it's a bigger, I'm sure it's not that easy, but that's what I'm trying to say.
What, how about others on here? What do you, have you seen some of this? And I do think this is a Trump effect issue. I've seen, this was one really bad example, and this is sort of just a variation on the real life. But I've gotten probably 5 or 6 different calls on these kinds of issues popping up. The technology I thought was an interesting twist. But students against students taking on classmates, but also attacking teachers or attacking administrators, which I've found is kind of an interesting twist on it. I haven't seen as much of that in my time with schools. And Laura, I think you're right. I mean, I think for many schools, when I talk about this example, most people agree those 5, like the sort of the ringleaders, the chief instigators, were probably gone. And, you know, you do an investigation, you kind of shake it out. Happily, most of our kids are not criminal masterminds yet. Some of them are working in that direction, but for the most part, you know, you can figure it out. But then you've got sort of that whole other group. And in the real life example, it was a really big group of kids. The school would have had to expel basically the equivalent of all of the boys in the junior class if they were going to expel them all. And there's this piece of the teacher rights, you know, particularly, you know, if there's a violence component. In some states, like in Virginia, just this existing and these students putting it together is a felony because it's threatening to a teacher. And, you know, so you have potential reporting obligations, that sort of piece. But then there is that, you know, what are the teacher rights to work in a school that feels safe to them? And it depends a little bit on the nature of the video. But I am kind of curious, and Laura, I think you're going in this direction, about how did the students get to this place? You know, where are we culturally? How are we talking with students, and what sort of groundwork is being set that they feel like this kind of behavior is acceptable in some degree, even if it's just in kid world? You know, because we're seeing it with websites, you see it with Snapchat things kind of going around and all of the kids jumping in on these exchanges. I think watching that cultural piece right now is really, really important, particularly in these diversity areas, because I am seeing a lot of it, and it's getting a bad twist. It's getting a bad angle on it that I haven't seen before. And my last question there is one that I'm really struggling with these days, whether it's on this topic or some of the other ones. You know, for a lot of these kids, if you look at this, if you look at this scenario, say they're juniors in high school or seniors in high school, a college is not going to accept these kids in this environment right now. And by definition, we're working with kids, right, who don't have fully formed frontal lobes. Like, our job is to work with kids who are going to make mistakes because they're kids. This is what they do. So this issue of how do we manage issues in a time when mistakes are getting to be more unforgivable? How do we work with them on the front end from a social emotional learning piece and the tolerance and respect piece, so that they're thinking through the consequences of these actions a little bit more? Because I'm getting more, I mean, I had another call about one of these earlier, you know, a couple of kids were selling drugs on campus. 10 years ago, higher ed would have had a problem with that, but not necessarily a huge one. You could still get them in some places. Now it's getting much more complex when you're talking about, you know, dealing any kind of drugs on campus, and the sexual assault issues go down the same road. Any questions on this particular topic? Okay. So this was one from the group. Zeb is in 8th grade and his parents are divorced. His mother insists on regular meetings with his teachers and routinely sends emails at all hours of the night regarding her son. She's been following the math teacher home in the hopes of getting Zeb's algebra grade changed, and she yells at the lacrosse coach from the sidelines. Occasionally, she seems to have had too much to drink at school social events. She did not sign the school enrollment agreement, and she does not pay tuition. This behavior cannot continue as it is too disruptive to your school. What can you do, and what would be helpful? Does anybody have anything in place that helps you here, and have you ever used it?
Deborah, I think maybe, this is Virginia, I think maybe what would be helpful here is if the enrollment agreement probably was used in a better way by having both parents signing the agreement versus only the parent that's paying, or whatever the situation might be in this case. I think that would be helpful. And a little bit more of something to stand on.
What language would be helpful for you in there? Do you have something like that, Virginia?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I do believe that we do have some language about the conduct of the student as well as the parents, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but there is some language in there about the conduct.
Yeah, and you know, and I think that's exactly right. I've got a couple examples. I actually have a publication on this that I'm happy to share with the group. I've just kind of highlighted some of the key terms in this. It does really help. Most schools have it in their handbook. I think it really helps to reiterate it in the enrollment agreement. And even if you have a parent who's not, you know, they're not financially on the hook, or they don't want to sign something where they're not financially on the hook, that outlines the obligations here. It's not mandatory, but it helps. That they've acknowledged that they've received those policies. They understand that this is how it'll work. I had a big flash on this about 10 years ago. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I've had more of a flash on this. And I think some of it is, you know, sort of tuition anxiety to some degree, because it's come up now in a couple parts of the country over the last, say, 2 months. So this is sort of one version, and usually it all goes to a positive and constructive working relationship. Sometimes this is sort of the smaller version in your enrollment contract, and you have sort of an extended dance version in your school handbook. This is the other one, and you can have these slides, so you can take this and tweak it and share it with your attorney. We have seen these challenged in a couple parts of the country, and generally speaking, they're pretty enforceable. The key is not just to have the term, and the term will help, but sometimes you can run into some drafting issues in court. You want to make sure that the parents are on notice, so it's in the handbook. You're going to bring this parent in, right? Like, so when you've reached this point, you've probably talked to this mom a couple times about her behavior. You've probably talked to the dad a couple times about her behavior. But then you say this in conversations, this is part of our agreement, this is how it works. You reiterate those expectations, and then you send that follow-up email, thanks so much for coming in, so enjoy talking to you today, just as a reminder. This is really important to how, you know, our relationship, you know, a healthy relationship works, blah, blah, blah. And then it's consistently applied. So regardless of position across of the parents, including the board chair spouse, who always seems to be the one who's leading candlelight vigils on the front steps, all of those pieces, you want to make sure that it's consistent. You can also extend it out, so it doesn't just have to be parents. Like, I've got some great grandparent alums who've also engaged in some really exciting behavior. And again, it's better to have them sign. So you always want to build in that notice piece. And of course, it's always easier not to re-enroll them as opposed to kicking them out. But you can use it either way. But it is something that I've seen more of. I've heard from more schools on this topic in the last couple of months than I have in the previous few years.
Deborah, this is Ellen again from Manhattan Country School.
Yeah.
I guess my question would be, knowing the way our school runs, we would likely be hesitant to not re-enroll because of our concern for the child and the environment of the child, hoping that we could make some kind of a positive change.
Yes.
Whether it's providing support for the child or engaging the parent who's having these difficulties, and try to help create, be a partner in trying to help make that situation better. Do you see that as a problem in terms of our liability?
No, I think as long as you're clear about when you've hit the wall.
Mm-hmm.
When I turned 40, I got these awesome business cards that I need to find, and apparently David Sedaris puts them out. They're black, and they say in white. They say in white, "Stop talking." And eventually we do reach that point, right, where you've engaged. And what I've seen schools do commonly, sort of a coping mechanism for a parent like this, is to require the parent to go through one administrator. So it might be the middle school head of school, or it might be the head of school, or somebody who's managing that relationship. If she's become too demanding kind of on the resources across the board, trying to find different mechanisms to work with her in a proactive, socially healthy way. The drinking thing, you've always got to be careful of. I've got a lot of parents drinking in carpool. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but you've always got that safety component to bear in mind too.
Yeah, of course.
So there's always that piece. But I think as long as you can work it and you can work it and you can work it, but once parents start sort of stalking teachers to their homes, you might reach the point where you're like, okay, I'm done.
Right. I mean, if it becomes a criminal possibility, sure.
or just uncomfortably a little bit nuts. I think that's fine. I mean, every school is going to have sort of their different line in the sand on that topic. And you just have to know when you've reached yours.
Okay.
So, and a little inconsistency is fine. It's not, you kind of have to have a little EQ on what that looks like on cross-examination.
Right.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Other questions on that one? Okay. Your history teacher has been with the school for 5 years. You need to let him go for repeatedly failing to fulfill his obligations, including failing to appear for dorm duties, study hall, and overseeing the school paper with another teacher. He lives in on-campus housing. What happens? Does anybody face this issue? Somebody.
Is it me?
No, that was awesome. That Paul, there's something going on with Paul's microphone that makes him sound like Mickey Mouse on speed, which is fabulous.
Paul, if you want to send me an email with your, I'm afraid we probably won't work out the audio issues in a timely enough way. If you want to send me an email with the question, I will ask it.
A chat message, George.
Or a chat message to the group. You can just send a chat message at the very bottom of the screen. There's a little chat bubble. You can just type in your message right there. We'll all see it.
I sent something like this in where we have about 50 or so faculty that live on campus, and some live in dorms, and some people have campus housing that don't live in dorms. And what happens when you have to let go of someone? You don't renew the contract, and there's just a lot of anger, and other people are saying, I'm scared of him. So a young guy who's older department chair, female, says, I'd like security outside my classroom if he's still on campus. And it doesn't happen often. And usually, I mean, you used the phrase, emotional intelligence before. I think with really good, open, honest communication at that, it tends to work itself out. But I worry all the time about work, anger, and especially as I'm just finishing my second year, and I've let, as George knows, I've let quite a few people go, and so I always worry about who's going to come back, and I'm sure other heads think about this too, and then people like this where they're on campus for another 3 months.
Right.
And so I think my guess is if it's that bad, then they leave early and you find coverage. But I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. So, there are a couple of different things in play here, right? So we've got, so transition benefits. So if you're just firing somebody, unless you've got some weird lease thing with these people, like you can get them to move off campus immediately, and you might give them a package to cushion the blow or whatever, but you can move them off campus immediately. Generally speaking, there's no requirement that they get to stay on campus, but you do need to build it into what the housing issues are. So if you're providing housing that it's dependent on employment, and if they're no longer employed at the school, they're no longer on campus, that kind of thing. The minute that you start getting into those safety issues, like if you feel like it's honestly unsafe, you get the person off campus. Like you do let them go early, and you kind of bite the disruption bullet rather than being concerned about that month over month. I've also seen schools work with local law enforcement to say, hey, this has happened. We're just a little bit worried about this, and they will beef up, their response time to the school or the way they patrol the school, or they'll sort of provide extra bodies over there to help give you a little bit more coverage. But if somebody's expressing sort of a concern for their physical safety, like to me, that's it's it's the red flag that the game is over. Like we're not doing this anymore.
Right.
It's just not. It's not worth taking the risk. And we have seen this before. I mean, we have had a shooting in an independent school, and we just don't. You don't need to go down that road. And the same is true if you're starting the school year after letting a number of employees go. That they know you're starting the year with that potential issue out there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, other questions on this front is, and students frankly are the same. We've had a couple scenarios come up where real student health, mental health, safety issues have arisen. And I've had schools actually they'll put the student on leave, and particularly if the parents are not fully engaged, they're not recognizing that their student is a potential real threat to the school. They'll put the student on leave, and they won't actually expel the student until after the school year is over, to ensure that the student doesn't come back to campus and cause potential physical harm. So you can kind of balance some of those things out too, but this safety issue, this campus safety, particularly if you have a campus that's not easily controlled from a safety standpoint, if you have a big campus, if you've got pretty porous entrances and exit onto your campus, it's not worth risking some of the issues that can come into play. Other questions on that front? Okay. So this next one is one of my favorites. You're at the end of the year and you've been looking over your budget to actual numbers now that graduation has passed. For the third year running, you've surpassed your legal budget, largely due to a disgruntled parent, an off-campus sexual assault investigation, and your staff handbook update. How do you keep these costs under control, whether it's a retainer or something else? Somebody asked this question. Does anybody have anything they use to keep your legal costs under control? Anyone? Anybody feel like their legal costs have gotten kind of out of control over the last couple of years, or it's just a total, you have no way of really budgeting for it because you have no clue what's going to come up?
Right, it's hard to budget.
Go ahead, Laura.
No, I'm all set.
Go ahead, Virginia.
I was going to say this is really hard to keep under control. especially with some of the topics you listed here.
Yeah.
Anytime you have any sexual assault investigations or employee issues, disgruntled parents, there's all sorts of topics that come up within the year that could definitely drive those costs up.
I think that's right. I mean, and kind of what I've laid out, I've talked to schools about this over time and with attorneys. And I love my brother in a bar, but I also think, and my husband's one, it has gotten completely out of control. Legal services, they're not structured properly for any kind of cost savings whatsoever. So I'll tell you what I do, because I'm not afraid to look like a nut when I talk to lawyers. I get across the board discounts. So with the exception of one attorney, I get 15% off all of my legal bills. And I just get it up front. I ask for it up front, and it is just built into everything that I do. And because I do that, I look for firms that have a lot of depth so they can help me do different things. So they can help me with standard hotel contracts, but they can also help me with technology agreements. So I'm not constantly trying to reinvent the wheel, which I think really helps. I also negotiate yearly services that they provide at no fee. They'll actually, they take me out to lunch a couple times a year, or they'll come to the office and do sexual harassment training or other kind of trainings that I need to get done every year. That I either can't or don't have time for, or people are tired of listening to me, so I get somebody new to come in and talk. And just build that in. Just say, hey, this would be really helpful to us. And most attorneys will be pretty good about that, particularly the employment attorneys, because they also want to know your school culture and they want to know these things are happening, and it's pretty easy for them to do. Negotiate a flat rate on certain services, like particularly things like updating the handbook or whatever. Say, I want to spend no more than X. Do not let them bill you in 6-minute increments. For some associate who's never done an employment handbook before to go through your employment handbook, it'll cost you $1 gazillion. And it still won't be very good. So just say, I want to, this is the 3-year cycle. I want to do the employment handbook 1 year, this handbook the other year, this handbook the other year. And we're going to keep it rotating. And it's just a flat, no more than $3,000, period. And it incentivizes them to be efficient and to get somebody who can do it efficiently on the program, and where your costs are. And most law firms are really good about that. If they say, look, all these new things have come into place, I can do it for 4, fine, but then you've got a cap on it, what that is. The 6-minute increments, like some law firms, particularly that work with schools, have moved away from 6-minute increments. Imagine billing your life in 6-minute increments, and they really, really do. Some law firms that work with schools have gone to like 10 or 15-minute increments, which I think is generally a little healthier. And they round down or round up depending on where they're closer to. And how compulsively are they billing you? So if you're sort of talking to them off the cuff at some event or, whatever it is, are they always billing you for that time? That's not going to be a great attorney relationship for a school, because we just don't work that way. But then when you look at your own practices, and whether you're the head of school or the business officer, or if you ever let staff members who don't deal with attorneys often loose with an attorney, or they have that person's phone number, they need to understand how that attorney bills and how do you maximize efficiency. So you don't call them with a bunch of one-off questions. You save up a few questions so you can have it in 1 hour-long conversation, and boom, 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 you can kind of move right through it. If you need to set that up regularly, that's great, but just make sure you're maximizing that efficiency. This last term, these punitive billing practices, is a term a friend of mine taught me when he was an associate in a big DC firm. If you're constantly kind of shooting spitballs at your lawyer with all kinds of random questions and this kind of project and that kind of project, and they're having to turn things around at night or under sort of weird circumstances, and it's foreseeable, you're not going to have a healthy relationship with them. So you really need to think about, they are under the gun almost all the time, particularly if you're dealing with big firms. So that last block of bullet points, you really want to take to heart and get into the practice of thinking about, okay, how are we really using this? They're not another staff person you just kind of call into your office. It's really pulling it together and using them as efficiently and effectively as possible. When you've got huge things, because I totally agree, Virginia, like when you've got a sex abuse case, a student-on-student sexual assault, those kinds of things, you want to negotiate the discount up front, and you want to get a range of what those expenses are going to look like. And it might be that your insurance company will help you cover some of that. So to get them sort of in the loop too. I will say with insurance companies, I've been doing a lot of work with United Educators over the last couple of years. The amount of resources they have that can be so helpful to schools is really a little bit mind-boggling. And I know other insurance companies have this too. Don't be afraid to kind of call on that and pull that together. The other thing that I've been encouraging, particularly state groups like yours to do, is to work together. So if you want, you know, like sort of the hip thing is to get waivers for employment references. Like you can all use the same waiver form. You don't all need to pay, you know, whatever, George, I don't know what your membership is, say 130 attorneys, different attorneys to draft the same release for all of you. They can do it for all of the schools. And you can share some of those resources. Or if you have, you know, if you're all in Albany and you've got 20 of you in one place, you can all go in and get some of these resources together or get some of the advice together. And that way you're not paying a bunch of different attorneys to do the same work and recreate the wheel every time. But I think it's time to come up with some efficiencies here because it's gotten completely out of hand. Virginia?
Debra, do you have any suggestions on how often you would recommend changing a legal firm, or you know, do you have them and you have them for 20 years or 10 years or?
It depends on what you like them.
No, I know, but I mean, is there some benefit in changing legal firms? And also when you do that, what is the best way of doing that? Do you have recommendations for certain to go out with an RFP on the legal firms, or to just, you know, call up your area top 3 or 5 or whatever and make appointments with them? How would you go about that process a little bit?
Yeah, I don't feel like you need to change attorneys a whole lot. So like, I'm a big fan of when you've got an attorney who's really working for you, to stick with that person as long as they've still got that depth of bench. If you want to change, and I do occasionally, I always feel a little bit bad about this. So, you know, school will call me with an issue and I'll kind of bullet, you know, here are the different things for you to think about. And then they're like, you know, and they get through that, and 3 weeks later, they're like, hey, we're thinking about changing our lawyer. You want somebody with school experience. You know, we're not processing widgets. You know, we're dealing with incredibly vulnerable populations, but we're also by definition setting ourselves up to take risks. You know, we really want to do that. So if you're doing it, you could do an RFP, or you could just interview different firms that, you know, get some references from other schools that, you know, work with different attorneys. Don't be afraid to use attorneys that aren't necessarily right there physically. They don't have to be right down the street from you. Or you can have some attorneys who do some things that are right down the street from you because you're going to fight with this parent, but you've got other firms that have got like sort of a deeper range. And then really talk to them. They'll take the time to talk to you and do, you know, sort of, whether it's a potential client lunch or come in and meet your administrative team or meet some of your board members in your administrative team. But take the time to make sure it's a good cultural match, because each of you has different things going on. You know, Laura's got dorms, Ellen's got kids going to marches. Like, you got all kinds of different things happening on different campuses. So sort of know what some of those things are and what challenges are coming up. You know, if you've got a big building project coming up, you want a firm that's got some ability to help you with that. So try to pre-identify that a little bit down the line. But don't be afraid. They're not, you know, they really are marketing and they know they're expensive. So like, don't be afraid to interview a bunch of them and ask them very direct questions and just tell them what you want. Sometimes I think we dance around it a little too much, and it's nice to just get that discount in place, and then you don't really even have to think about it again. And I'll still bounce bills back to people. I don't do it very often, but occasionally I'll be like, I didn't need 4 attorneys on that phone call, so bill me at the highest billing attorney's rate, and I'm not paying for these other 3 people. You know, don't be afraid to do that, because that's.
You've been successful at that?
What's that?
You've been successful at that?
Oh yeah, no, they know I won't pay it. Well, it's like having a med student come in. You know, you're in the hospital doing whatever, and a med student comes in and is shadowing the attorney, and you're paying for the med student too. You know, and I've had some fabulous associates work on things, and they are awesome, and they can knock it out. But you don't want to pay for all of their training on your tab either. At the same time, if you get a cheap associate who really wants to go to small claims court and get in it with the deadbeat parent who's not paying your bills, like, worth the weight in gold. Go for it. Because nobody wants to take that case, and they want to get time in court. Okay, so
Deborah, how often do you recommend that we have sexual harassment trainings for faculty and staff, and what other types of annual or regular training is best practice?
Yeah, so for sex abuse trainings, like every year, preferably a couple times a year, and do it in a couple different ways. Like beginning of the year, it's good to do overall reminders of what your policies and practices are in terms of reporting, in terms of where you are with technology and expected communications on technology. If you have a code of conduct, and if you don't have one, you should develop one, what that code of conduct says. You can use also a group like Darkness to Light or RAIN to provide sort of regular trainings. They'll do it online. They do train the trainer. You can do all that sort of stuff. But I'm also a big fan of tabletop exercises for adults, including teachers, because, particularly with kids, whether it's a student-on-student sexual assault or sex abuse, like they never choose the person you want them to choose to talk to. Like they're going to choose the second-year English teacher, and that person's got no idea what to do with that report. So to make sure that you kind of drill down on that, like, so if a student comes to you and starts talking to you about this, where do you go? Who do you talk to? Or if a student is sort of crossing social boundaries, who do you go? Who do you talk to? Who's your mentor, particularly if you're a younger teacher? So those for me are, kind of a big training towards the beginning of the year when you've got the whole staff together, and then a couple tabletop exercises later in the year. That helping younger teachers with maintaining those boundaries, particularly those social boundaries, is huge. And that's because reporting has become so de rigueur, which I think is great, but that's becoming more frequent with smaller incidents that are more suspicion type things. And I'm worried that our younger teachers are going to get trapped in some of those because they don't know how to see when they're getting in trouble. So building those systems to support younger teachers, to give them good mentoring, to make them aware of what your professional expectations are on those fronts, I think is a really big deal. So that I don't think we do enough of that. I mean, you should have the standard when you're coming on board, but then you should have those yearly reminders and that occasional little ping to help teachers talk through it.
Thank you.